This is Matt Phelps from APEC Engineering out of Galveston, Texas. We're going to talk a little bit about hurricane investigations in wind versus flood. Where did the damage actually come from? Very hot topic here from Superstorm Sandy is what caused the damage. Was it wind or was it flood? And it's not always an easy question to answer. In fact, there's no one single investigation method that is appropriate. It takes different methods, and no one method is a panacea. There are all different tools that engineers have in our mathematical toolbox that we can use to determine the force that caused the damage. Did it come from wind or did it come from flood? And we develop these things using mathematics that are very old, that have been taught in literally every structural engineering curriculum in these United States for many years. So, how do we do this kind of thing? Well, you need to begin with the end in mind, as Stephen Covey says. So we want to have at the end of this a credible report that is compelling in the story that it tells, and that the story is based upon the evidence and the data that is collected and analyzed as a part of the report. So it begins with accurate, verifiable weather data. And that weather data has got to be placed upon a timeline. A timeline is one of the most fundamental components of any forensic investigation. Anybody that's watched CSI or some other cop show, you know one thing. They always catch the bad guy by collecting the data and putting it on a timeline to see that it fits with when the dirty deed was actually done. Well, we do that same thing. So, how do we go about doing that? You know, how do we collect this information? Where does it come from? How do we turn this information into a report that is of use to you, the damaged building owner that has your structure damaged by the storm? Well, there's a lot to the investigation. And it starts in a place that may not really be intuitive. And that is that it's not just about how hard the wind blew. It's how hard the wind blew relative to the building code that the design wind speed is based upon. For example, if a structure is designed for a 75-mile-an-hour design wind speed, and when I say that, we're talking about wind gusts, not 1-minute averages. If it's designed for a 75-mile-an-hour design wind speed, then it's more likely than not that damage would occur when you have a wind gust that is close to 75 miles an hour. That's very relevant here. Here where Hurricane Sandy tore up your building or your home. But what about where I live, down in Galveston, Texas, or where my good friend Ivan Browner lives down in Florida? Our design wind speeds are 130 and 145 miles an hour respectively. We probably wouldn't have a whole lot of wind damage from a 75 mile an hour wind. That's because our buildings, our structures, they are designed to accommodate that. Up here, not so much. This is something that is very common and happens in every storm. There's nothing unique about it being up here in this part of the world, or unique with it being related to Hurricane Sandy. It happens in every storm. Now, building codes have changed over the years. If you are currently located in, let's say, Trenton, New Jersey, for example, your design wind speed is going to be about 90 miles an hour. However, maybe you live in a house that was designed and built under the 1970 Uniform Building Code. That design wind speed pencils out to be more along the lines of about 75 miles an hour. Maybe you live in a home that was built under a 1936 local building code in the city of New York. Your design wind speed might not have been but 45 miles an hour. So it is relevant to the structure, and that's the reason that our investigations have to include when was the building built, what building code was relevant at the time that it was built. Now, even though that gust speeds in Hurricane Sandy are not really spectacular as what we would have, say, what we've had recently down in Texas and in Florida, the gust speeds here are close to the design wind speeds. So it would be reasonable to assume that we would have some wind damage. Does that mean that you absolutely have wind damage? Absolutely not. You may or you may not. That's the reason that the physical damage has to match up with the causation model. Now, in doing all this stuff, you know, where do we get this? Where does the weather data come from that this is based upon? How do we know that what we are doing is credible? Well, our weather data comes from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The Storm Prediction Center is the first entity under the NOAA umbrella. They are reporting what is happening with the storm as it is approaching a location. And they're giving warnings and they're issuing probabilities about wind speed and surge heights and things like that. And they give updates on about every 15 minutes. The closer it gets to land, the closer the updates. When it's out in the middle of the Atlantic, maybe not so frequently. The National Weather Service, though, is going to be collecting the data as the storm occurs in your location. And they will be collecting weather data from all different sources. There'll be airports, there'll be port authority associations, there'll be schools, there'll be public buildings, there'll be even research institutes such as Texas Tech University that are putting out instruments that are collecting the data that is as the storm is happening. That occurs while the storm is present. That's the real-time data. All of this data has to be accumulated, though, and have to try to make sense of it. That's the function of the National Climatic Data Center. They verify that the data is correct. They verify that the instrument that recorded that data was calibrated and that its calibration is traceable to a national standard. They can verify that that data was correct because they take the instrument down after they get through and they recheck its calibration, and if it's still calibrated, then you know you've got high quality data. Or they may compare it to a wind profile on a Doppler radar screen. So they have a Doppler radar that is supporting what that instrument says that it's reading. It's not just taken for granted that it's accurate. It is verified by one of the different means that the National Climatic Data Center uses. Then lastly, we have the National Hurricane Center. The NHC has a specific function that it takes the compiled certified data from the Climatic Data Center, and then they issue reports on significant named storms. And this occurs about maybe starting 90 days after the storm up to maybe years or a year or more after the storm. So these are things that don't happen immediately. When the National Climatic Data Center starts to accumulate its data, it may not really get started on that until 30 or 60 days after the storm before that data becomes available. It takes a while to do this. These agencies that do this, they only have so many people that work there that can do this. They don't have an unlimited budget. It takes a while to work through this, and there is a lot of data to look at. So it takes a little while to get this stuff done. The other thing that we do is we take all of this data that we just talked about and we put it on something I said just a minute ago. We put it on a timeline. We now know how hard the wind is blowing, how high the surge is at your location at a given point in time. Now, you didn't have an anemometer at your house or your business, but we can give a real good estimate as to what it was at your business based upon those nearest data points that are in your location. We can literally triangulate what the wind speed and the surge heights are at your location. Also, we get that data from NOAA on a 6-minute interval. So once every 6 minutes, we have a data point. Think of that as being like the pixels in a photograph. We have a really good image because the data points are so close together. They're only 6 minutes apart. So we take that and we lay that out on a graph, and we plot the wind speed. Again, what kind of wind speed? It's 3-second gust. It's not 1 minute sustained averages. It is 3-second gust. We plot that out over the entire storm period. We do the same thing with surge heights if they're in an area where their storage had occurred. Then we can compare that to your individual structure's ability to withstand an applied load. This is what in engineering speak we call the ultimate load. It's the structure's ability to resist an applied load pushing on it. Whether the load is a result of wind or flood doesn't make any difference. But we do calculate that for both the wind and for the flood. There's many different types of flood calculations to do. We have buoyancy forces, we have rising water, we have moving water or dynamic water, and we have breaking waves that are acting on the pilings or maybe on the side of the house if it's low enough and the surge is high enough. So we calculate all of these things and we add those all together, and that becomes the water load. We do the same thing with wind. We calculate the wind, and its load is different at different heights of the structure. If you have a house that's a slab on grade and is down low to the ground, the wind load on it will not be as high as if you have a house that is a 2-story house up on pilings. That one's going to have a much larger wind profile. So all of these are unique, and they are tied right back to your individual home and your individual situation. There are other things that affect the wind load. It's not just how hard the wind blows. It's also what is the exposure area around it. Is it sitting on a coastline? Is it in an urban area? Is it in a rural area? All of those things have an effect on how hard that wind is pushing on your house, and we calculate those things to determine what is the wind load. Where do we get all this stuff? It is published by the American Society of Civil Engineers in a document called Minimum Design Standards for Buildings and Other Structures. Those of us in the trade typically call it ASCE 7. This is a document that is taught in utterly every structural engineering curriculum in the United States. It is credible. It is usable, and it can be used for designing structures, and it can be used just as effectively in analyzing structures. And that is what we use it for in these cases. So what should an engineer's report do? Well, it's really pretty simple. It should present the unbiased facts. When I say it's unbiased, I mean it's real simple. It's math and engineering science. It's not skewed towards the favor of an insurance carrier, nor is it skewed towards the favor of a property owner. It is just the facts. We're kind of like Sergeant Joe Friday on Dragnet. Just the facts, ma'am. Now, typically, an insurance company will also hire an engineer to evaluate a property. So you have an engineer that is representing an insurance company that is doing some type of an evaluation, and you hopefully will have an engineer that is representing you, that they are writing a report that represents their opinion of what happened with the property. We did a lot of these in Texas following Hurricane Ike, hundreds. And I am fortunate enough that I was able to participate in helping a group of property owners resolve their cases with the Texas Windstorm Insurance Association. In this class action event, class action suit, the engineer representing the insurance company had an opinion as to what was the result of the forces acting on a given structure. And in this slide, we're showing these forces. We've got forces for wind, we've got forces for hydrostatic pressure, that's water that is still and not moving. We have forces for dynamic wind or dynamic water, that's water that's moving. We have forces for breaking waves that are crashing into the pilings that the house is sitting on. We also have what's called a buoyancy force, and that's where what the water is sitting in, it is trying to lift it up and move it off of its foundation. Well, if you look at the graph, it looks like all of the forces are from the breaking wave forces. Of course that's what damaged the house. Look at it, it's huge. Look at the difference. Well, that may be a fact, but that's not the most important thing. Is it relevant? It's only an important fact if it's relevant. If it's not relevant, then it doesn't matter. Well, that's exactly the case that we see here in this slide. We see something that appears to be an important fact. The question that this slide does not answer is it relevant? So, in this case, the engineer had determined that 11% of the damage was caused by wind and 89% of it was caused by the flood. Now, using our energy-based method, what we call alpha, the applied load force analysis, our report came to a little bit different conclusion. So, how did we go about this? Well, I told you a little bit a while ago, you start out with a timeline. We plotted the wind load, that's the wind speed converted into the wind force acting on the structure, over the period of time that was of the interest, which is during the part of the storm when the forces were at the highest, when the wind was at the worst, the flood was at its highest. We plotted the wind, we plotted the flood, and then we compared those to, what did we call that? The ultimate load, that's right. We compared it to the building or the structure's ability to resist that applied load. It doesn't care what source the load came from. It could be wind, it could be flood, it could be a snow load, it could be a mudslide, it doesn't matter. It's the building's structural ability to resist an applied load. Well, funny thing, you can add loads together. You can add the wind load and the flood load together and you see how does that affect this building. At what point did it actually breach or exceed the ultimate load of the building? Now what happens if it does that? What happens when you breach the ultimate load? That's when a failure will begin. We don't know exactly what the failure may be. It may be in fasteners, which it usually is, or it could be broken structural members. It could be uplift. It could be a lot of different things. We don't know exactly what it is, but we do know as soon as it exceeds the ultimate load of that building, it is more likely than not that something started failing. Now, we tie this causation back to the damage profile that we investigated and we saw. So you have to tie these two together. If they don't match, something's not right. We make sure that we fully understand the damage profile, and then we begin the investigation of the causation model. Well, if you look at this slide here, you can see that we have a wind speed or wind force that when you add the flood load to it, it exceeds the ultimate load of the building. This is shown by the line that's in maroon. My friends at Texas A&M will just love me. As those forces begin to increase up to the maximum of the storm, we know somewhere between the time that it breached that line and the time that it reached its maximum intensity, that is when the failure occurred. It's not logical to assume that the failure would have occurred after the peak intensity had occurred, because if it was going to fail at that load, it would have done so earlier when that load had previously occurred. So now we have got some really, really important evidence, and that is that we have got the time of when the failure started and the time by which the failure is logically complete. So we now can conclude that this failure, whatever the failure may be, occurred somewhere between time A and time B. If we can do that, then we can calculate how much of the total load is attributed to the wind and how much is attributed to the flood. Now, if you look at this graph, you can see that clearly the wind was acting on this structure before the flood ever even got there. So if the wind is already consuming 51%, which is what I'm showing in this graph, if the wind is already consuming 51% of the building's ability to resist a load, what we call the ultimate load, if the wind's already consuming 51% of the ultimate load, how much is left? Well, in my math book, 100% minus 51% means 49% is all that's left. So if the wind is consuming 51% of that structure's ability to resist an applied load, 49% is all that's left. And I don't care how high the flood may have got, 49% is all that's left. Though if the wind's already consumed something, then it's no longer present there to resist the flood load. And that's the basis of this energy balance method of how we analyze these storms. It's very important to have a very good understanding of how the storm occurred. We have to analyze the first load, which is wind in this case, which is typically the case with a hurricane type event, because something's moving that water. It's not moving on its own. That water is moving in response to wind blowing on it. And that is one of the things that is causing the water to create the surge. There's other things that affect that, certainly, such as barometric pressure, and the tides. But what is there first is the wind. If you didn't have the wind, you wouldn't have the surge. So that is a big portion of how these investigations proceed. So be sure that you understand this. If the wind is consuming 51% of the ultimate load, how much is left to resist the flood load? I hope I just heard 49%. In closing, the alpha method has helped hundreds of insurance professionals and building owners to understand the wind and flood forces that are acting on their structures. And I hope that it can help you too. Thank you.